Somewhere beneath your feet right now, if you are sitting still enough to feel it, there is a low vibration that never quite stops. Ships have that. Old buildings have it. The ocean has it at depth. The people who have gone looking for the source of that particular vibration in the wrong places have come back changed, or have not come back at all. Welcome to Midnight Outcry. Tonight, every account in this compilation takes place on or near the water, on vessels, on coastlines, in the deep interior spaces of ships that were never meant to be explored, and in rooms that should not exist at all. These are first-hand accounts submitted to this channel by real people who have asked that their full names not be used for reasons that will become obvious as you hear them. Some of them have spoken to maritime authorities. Some of them have filed reports. None of them received an answer that made sense. We ask only that you listen with the lights on, and that if anything in these accounts sounds familiar to you, you reach out through the link in the description below. If you have not already subscribed to Midnight Outcry, please do so now and ring the notification bell so you do not miss a single upload. We release new compilations every week, and tonight's accounts are among the most disturbing we have ever shared. I want to start by telling you that I am not someone who frightens easily. I spent 11 years working commercial maritime before any of this happened, and in that time I saw weather systems that would end careers, equipment failures that should have been fatal, and close calls that I filed away and moved past the way you have to in this industry if you want to keep functioning. I tell you this not to establish bravado, but because I want you to understand that when I say what happened on the Stellarian changed me in a way I have not recovered from, I am saying it as someone who had a very high threshold for what could change me. The thing that still keeps me from sleeping on certain nights is not the room itself. It is what was on the walls inside it. I am 38 now. My name is Marcus, and I have been sailing since I was 19. I grew up in Galveston, Texas, close enough to the water that the smell of salt and diesel was part of my earliest memories. I did my first commercial rotation at 22, worked my way up through a series of bulk carriers and container ships, and by the time I was 32, I was working as a second officer on a mid-sized Panamanian-flagged cargo vessel called the Stellarian. She was not a glamorous ship. She was a working ship, about 220 meters in length, with a crew of 23, built in the late 90s and refurbished once in 2009. She carried mixed cargo across the North Atlantic and occasionally dipped into the Mediterranean on longer rotations. She was the kind of ship that felt lived in, which in the maritime world means something specific, the kind of ship where you could tell every inch of her had been used and maintained and used again by decades of crews who each left something small of themselves behind. We departed Hamburg in early November on a standard rotation toward Halifax. The weather in the North Atlantic at that time of year is what it always is: unpredictable, cold, and deeply indifferent to your schedule. The first 3 days out were unremarkable. The crew was professional, the cargo was secured, and I had just come off a 4-week leave that left me rested enough to actually enjoy the watch rotations instead of grinding through them. I noticed something small on the second morning out, something I registered and set aside without giving it much weight. I was doing my standard walk-through inspection of the lower decks, and I passed a watertight door in the aft section of Deck 3 that I had passed dozens of times on previous rotations, and something about it felt different. I could not tell you what exactly. The door looked the same. The handle was the same. The signage was the same. But there was a quality to the air coming from the gap at the bottom of it that was colder than it should have been, and it had a smell I could not immediately place. Not a bad smell, exactly. More like the inside of a very old stone building, the kind of cold mineral smell that suggests depth and age. I told myself the ventilation system was redistributing cold air from the refrigerated cargo hold 2 sections forward. I continued my walk-through. On the 4th day out of Hamburg, one of our ABs, a young Latvian man I will call Davis, came to me during the afternoon watch with something he described as a question about the ship's layout. He held up a deck plan printout, the kind we kept in the bridge station as secondary reference, and pointed to a section in the aft lower hull. He asked me what the notation at the bottom of the plan referred to, The notation was a small printed reference to something labeled simply as D0. He asked what deck 0 was. I told him there was no deck 0. The Stellarian had a standard configuration weather deck, then decks 1 through 5 descending into the hull, with the tank top and void spaces below 5. I had never seen the notation D0 on any version of the ship's plan that I had worked from, and I assumed the copy he had found was an older printing that contained an error, or perhaps a reference to a structural void space that had been renumbered in a later revision. I told him not to worry about it. He nodded and went back to his duties. He did not look entirely satisfied with my answer, but he accepted it. That night I could not sleep. This was not unusual for me in the first week of a rotation, when my body was still calibrating to the ship's rhythm and the watch schedule. I lay in my bunk for 2 hours listening to the deep structural sounds of the vessel, the long low groaning of a hull under Atlantic swell, the constant white noise of the engine room transmitted through the steel frames, the particular percussion of water against the outer hull at specific intervals. I had slept through all of these sounds hundreds of times, but there was something else layered underneath them. It was a sound I had no reference for. I described it later as a slow rhythmic pressing, like something very heavy being moved across a metal floor in a regular pattern, but from a direction and depth that did not correspond to any compartment I knew to be in use. I convinced myself it was cargo shifting in the hold, checked the manifest in my head, recalled that the cargo was containerized and secured, and fell asleep approximately an hour later. I want you to understand that in that moment, I genuinely believed my own explanation. I was not in denial. I was doing the thing that experienced mariners do. I was applying the most rational available answer and moving on. The next day Davis did not appear for his morning watch. This was out of character. He was young but reliable, the kind of sailor who showed up early and worked quietly and did not cause problems. Our bosun covered his station, and we assumed he had been ill in the night. When I checked on him in his cabin at mid-morning, he was not there. His bunk was empty. His personal effects were present. His shoes were beside the bunk. The ship was searched in the standard pattern. He was not found on any deck, any space, any compartment that we had access to. The captain logged a man overboard report, and we executed the MOB protocol altered course, deployed the Solar's equipment, notified the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax and the watch vessel on our last reported position. We conducted the search for 6 hours. We found nothing. During the search, I went back to that watertight door on deck 3. I do not know what made me go there specifically. There were 37 compartments we had cleared, and I was working through them in sequence. But when I reached that door, the cold mineral smell was stronger than before, and it was no longer just coming from the floor gap. It was coming from around the entire frame of the door, as if the pressure differential on the other side had increased. The handle turned. The door opened. What was behind it was not the system's corridor I would have expected. It was a ladder, descending. The ladder was steel, original to the ship's construction based on the patina of the metal, and it went down further than it should have based on my understanding of the ship's geometry. There should have been no space below me beyond the void tanks, but the ladder descended at least 12 feet into an enclosed space I had no chart reference for at all. I went down. I want to be clear that this was not bravery. This was professional obligation because I was looking for a missing crew member. The space at the bottom of the ladder was approximately the size of a large cabin, maybe 5 meters by 4. The ceiling was low. The air was very cold. There was no light source, and I was using my inspection torch. The floor was original steel plate, and it was clean, which meant it was not a void space that had gone unused. Something had been clearing it. The walls were the detail that stayed with me. The walls had markings on them, not graffiti, not tooling marks, not the kind of casual scratching that bored sailors sometimes leave on interior bulkheads. These were deliberate, dense, and covered every inch of every wall, from deck level to as high as I could reach and beyond. They appeared to be in multiple hands, meaning multiple different people had made them over what I would estimate was a long period of time. I recognized enough to understand that some of them were words in languages I could not read. Some of them were diagrams or figures, and running along the base of all 4 walls at exactly the same height was a single continuous line of the same symbol repeated hundreds of times, the same figure, every single repetition identical, in a way that felt less like obsessive precision and more like something that should not have been physically possible to maintain. Davis was not in that room. There was no sign that he had ever been there. I took 12 photographs on my phone and went back up the ladder and closed the door. When I reported the space to the captain and described what I had found, he came down himself and opened the door. The ladder was there. The space below was there. The walls were bare. Every marking I had photographed was gone. My photograph showed the room. His eyes showed him nothing. The MRCC closed the search for Davis after 48 hours. The official finding was accidental man overboard in heavy seas. The seas that night had been 3 meters, which is not nothing, but it is not exceptional. And Davis had been a competent watch sailor. I completed the rotation. I did not return to that door. In my final week on board before I rotated off in Halifax, I heard the pressing sound again every night, always between 0200 and 0330, always from below. My photographs still exist. The markings are clear in every one of them. I have shown them to 3 people in the years since, and none of them can identify the language or the symbol at the base of the walls. The Stellarian is still in service. I have never sailed on her again, and I have turned down 2 assignments to do so. I do not believe Davis went overboard. I have no other explanation to offer you. I have only the photographs and the sound and the particular cold that still comes back to me sometimes when a room is very quiet and I am not paying attention. There is a pattern that runs through all of the accounts we receive from maritime workers, and it is this: the ships that hold the worst stories are rarely the old ones or the infamous ones. They are the ordinary ships, the working vessels with unremarkable names and unmemorable routes, the ships that have been doing the same passage for so many years that no one looks at them closely anymore. The next account comes from a woman who worked as a steward on a passenger ferry running the overnight route between 2 ports she has asked us not to name. She calls herself Elena. She was 26 at the time. She had worked ferry routes for 3 years, and she was, by her own description, the most skeptical person on any boat she had ever served on. She wants you to know that before she tells you the rest. I have never told this full story to anyone on the ship with me that night, because by the time morning came I had already understood that there would be no point. I am telling it now, 6 years later, because I recently found out that the woman in cabin 14 was not the first person to report what she reported, and that information changed what I am able to do with what I know. I found out 3 months ago that the same cabin had been flagged 4 times in the previous decade by different passengers on different sailings, all of them describing the same detail, the same specific request, delivered in the same specific way. The ferry company's records confirm this when I obtained them through a Freedom of Information request. The company has never publicly addressed it. The cabin is still in service. My name is Elena, and I was born in Tallinn, Estonia. I moved to work in Scandinavia when I was 22, and the ferry work suited me because I am practical, I am organized, and I have always felt more comfortable on the water than on land. The route I worked was an overnight sailing, approximately 9 hours, departing at 11 in the evening and arriving at 8 the following morning. It was a large modern vessel, comfortable by ferry standards, with private cabins for passengers who purchased them and open seating areas for foot passengers. The crew was 21 people. The nights were mostly routine embarkation, safety announcements, cabin service, minor passenger issues, then a quieter stretch from 2 to 5 in the morning when most people were asleep and the ferry was just moving through dark water. I liked those middle hours. I liked the particular quiet of a ship at night when most of its inhabitants are unconscious and the vessel is just itself, doing what it was built to do. The night in question was in February. Outside it was dark and the sea state was moderate, enough to feel the vessel working but not enough to affect the passengers in any meaningful way. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, I received a cabin service call from cabin 14. This was unusual in its timing, but not exceptional. Passengers on overnight ferries sometimes needed water, extra bedding, travel sickness medication. I knocked, identified myself, and the door opened. The woman inside was approximately 60 years old, well dressed for someone traveling overnight, with the composed and self-contained manner of a person who traveled frequently. She asked me, very calmly, whether I could tell her why the child outside her window kept looking in. Cabin 14 on this vessel was on the main passenger deck, which was at waterline. The external portholes on that deck were fixed glass, approximately 20 centimeters in diameter, positioned such that the outside of the glass was approximately 2 meters above the waterline when the vessel was at standard load. There was no external walkway, no ledge, no structure of any kind on which a person could stand or be suspended outside a porthole at that height, while the ferry was underway on open water. I told the passenger this in the most reassuring way I could manage. She nodded as if she had expected this answer and told me she understood that, but that the child had been there for approximately 40 minutes and she had been watching it watching her, and she felt I should know. She did not appear distressed. She appeared, if anything, mildly inconvenienced, the way a person is when something is wrong with their room that they did not cause and do not feel responsible for resolving, but feel obligated to report. I looked at the porthole. The glass was clean from the inside. I could see nothing through it but darkness and the occasional suggestion of wave tops when the ferry rolled slightly. I offered to move the passenger to a different cabin. She declined and said she preferred to stay and would like a glass of water and perhaps something to help her sleep. I provided both. I logged the complaint as a passenger disturbance. I did not look at the porthole again that night from the outside. The thing is, I did go outside, not immediately. At approximately 3 in the morning, during my check of the external passenger deck areas, I walked the length of the vessel on the port side, which was the side where cabin 14's porthole faced. The sea was dark, and the air was very cold, and the ferry's navigation lights gave a red cast to the water on that side. I walked the full length of the deck. When I reached the position corresponding to cabin 14, I stopped. There was nothing there. There was the hull, the porthole glass dark from outside because the cabin light was now off, the water below, the night, nothing. I stood there for perhaps 2 minutes. Then I looked at the glass more carefully. There was something on it. From outside, at close distance with my torch, I could see a mark on the outer surface of the porthole glass that had not been there. Earlier in the voyage I knew this, because we did external glass checks before every sailing as part of the cleaning protocol, and that glass had been clear at departure. The mark was small. It was in the shape of 2 handprints, very small handprints, positioned as if someone had pressed both hands flat against the outside of the glass and held them there. The handprints were below the center of the glass, not above or at the center, the position of a person who was smaller than the porthole and pressing upward to see in. The ferry was traveling at 17 knots on open water. The outside of that porthole was 2 meters above the waterline, with no external surface to stand on. I photographed the handprints. I cleaned the glass. I filed a report the following morning when we docked. The duty manager thanked me and noted it in the vessel log as an unidentified mark on external glazing, probable origin wave splash or debris contact. When I pushed back on this explanation and described the shape of the marks, he told me that sea spray could create surprising patterns on glass, and that the important thing was the glass itself was undamaged. I did not pursue it further at that time. The passenger from cabin 14 disembarked without further complaint. I never saw her again. 3 years later, I left the ferry company. 6 years later, I filed the Freedom of Information request and learned about the 4 prior incidents. All 4 of the earlier passengers had used the same word, not child. The word they had all used was the wrong size, as in, there was a figure outside, but it was the wrong size. I do not know what that means. I have not been on a ferry since I filed that request, and I do not plan to go back. Not every account sent to this channel comes from professional maritime workers. Some of them come from recreational sailors, from kayakers, from people who were simply in the wrong coastal place at the wrong time. This next account is from a man who calls himself Terence. He was 44 when this happened. He lives in the Pacific Northwest, and he wants me to tell you that he grew up 2 blocks from the water, that he has fished and paddled and sailed his entire life, and that he knows the difference between what the coast normally does and what it does not do. That was 2 years ago. I am telling you this now because last month, while I was kayaking a route I have paddled 100 times without incident, I heard it again, the same sound, from the same direction, from below the water, and slightly ahead of where I was paddling, keeping pace with me for approximately 4 minutes before it stopped. It has been quiet since. I do not know what to do with that. I am still working out how to tell the rest of what happened before it. My name is Terence. I am 46 now, and I live in a small coastal town about 40 miles north of Seattle, Washington. The kind of town where the waterfront is the center of everything, and where knowing the water is not a hobby, but a basic competency. I grew up in a family of commercial fishermen. My grandfather fished the same coastline for 50 years. My father added another 30. I grew up hearing their stories, and I grew up understanding that the water is not hostile, it is simply indifferent. And the way you survive in proximity to indifferent things is to pay close attention and to resist the instinct to dismiss what you observe. I say this because what I am about to tell you is the thing that has tested that philosophy more than anything in my life. 2 years ago, I was doing a solo kayak trip along a stretch of coastline that I know extremely well. This was in late September, which in the Pacific Northwest is still perfectly viable paddling weather if you are appropriately equipped and you know the tidal patterns. I had a dry suit, navigation equipment, a VHF radio, and a planned route that I had run at least 20 times in previous years. I set out from a public launch at about 7 in the morning with a plan to cover roughly 18 miles and camp overnight at a site I had used before. The first 8 miles were exactly as I expected: overcast, calm, the particular gray-green of Pacific Northwest coastal water in autumn, harbor seals on the rocks, the occasional fishing vessel moving out toward the banks. Normal, deeply familiar. I was at peace. Around the 11-mile mark, I noticed that the water beneath my hull had changed color. This is something experienced kayakers pay attention to, because color change in coastal water can indicate depth change, current, or underwater features. This particular change was from the standard gray-green to a darker, slightly blue-green tone that I associated with depth, but the chart I had showed no significant depth change in that area. The seafloor at that point should have been about 30 meters, consistent with the surrounding stretch. I noted it, adjusted my paddling line slightly eastward to stay over shallower ground, and continued. That was the moment I should have turned around. I know that now. I did not know it then. The sound started about 20 minutes later. I described it afterward as a vocalization from below the water, but that word vocalization is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because what I heard was not the sound of a known marine mammal, and I know what those sound like. I have spent my entire life around Pacific coastal waters. I know the low resonant call of gray whales. I know orca communications. I know stellar sea lion barking and the various sounds of harbor seals. This was none of those. It was a long, structured, descending tone that lasted approximately 3 seconds, paused, and then repeated from a different direction, as if whatever was producing it had moved between the first and second sound. The second repetition was closer. The third was directly below me. I stopped paddling. I sat in the kayak and I did not move, and I tried to produce a rational explanation. Submarines used this stretch occasionally. Naval exercises ran along this coast with some regularity, and low-frequency sound carries strangely in water and crew hull materials. I told myself it was sonar. I believed it for about 90 seconds. Then the fourth sound came, and it was not below me anymore. It was at the surface, approximately 10 meters to my left, at the waterline, and it had a quality that sonar does not have, a quality of something that was adjusting its output in response to conditions, the way a living thing adjusts, rather than the way a mechanical system repeats. I paddled hard, and I paddled without stopping for 45 minutes, until I reached a rocky outcropping that I could pull the kayak onto. I sat on that rock for 2 hours. The sound did not follow me to the shallows. When I finally made it to my planned campsite and had a fire going and something warm in my body, I called a friend who works as a marine biologist and described what I had heard. She was quiet for a moment and then she asked me where exactly I had been when I heard it. I told her the approximate coordinates. She was quiet again. Then she told me that she was not aware of any known species that would produce a sound matching that description in that area, but that the color change I had observed corresponded to a feature she had read about in a paper, an area of unexplained thermal variation at depth that had been noted by a survey vessel 2 years prior and not yet adequately explained. She said she would look into it. She came back to me 3 weeks later and told me the paper had been retracted. When I asked why, she said she could not find a retraction notice. The paper had simply been removed. The journal's website showed no record of it having been published. I completed the trip. I camped, I paddled home, I filed nothing because there was nothing definitive to file. But I have changed my route. I do not paddle through that stretch anymore. I go around it. The water there looks the same as it always did. My chart still shows 30 meters of depth at the 11-mile mark. Whatever changed the color of the water that day is not on any instrument I can access. The sound last month lasted 4 minutes and then stopped. I am telling you this so that when it comes back, and I believe it will come back, there is a record of it somewhere that I did not make by myself. The accounts we receive from people who work on ships are different in one specific way from the accounts we receive from recreational users of the water, and that difference is this. The maritime workers already know something is wrong before they submit to us. They have had time to sit with it, to exhaust the official explanations, to discover that their records were altered or their reports were absorbed into administrative language that changed what happened into something manageable. The recreational accounts have a rawness to them that the professional accounts have processed away. But the professional accounts have a specific kind of dread that comes from institutional knowledge, from knowing what the systems are, knowing how reporting works, and knowing with precision the exact moment the system stopped making sense. The final account tonight comes from a man who spent 14 years in the maritime industry before this happened. He calls himself James. He worked as a marine surveyor. His job was, specifically, to determine what was real on a vessel and what was not. He wants you to hold that in mind. I keep finding the same number. That is the thing I have not been able to explain to anyone, and have stopped trying to explain because the conversation always goes the same way. The number is in places it should not be. On the survey report that was written before I submitted mine. On the tide table for the night I was on the vessel. On the security pass I was issued that morning, in the block that should have contained the vessel registration number. The number is wrong for every context in which it appears. It corresponds to nothing in any registry I have access to. I have been looking for it for 4 years. I intend to keep looking. My name is James. I was born in Aberdeen, Scotland, and I have been connected to the maritime industry for as long as I can remember. My father was a fisherman, and my uncle worked the North Sea oil platforms, and I grew up understanding that the ocean was not a backdrop, but an active environment with its own systems and its own logic, and that the way you worked safely within it was to learn its language as well as you could, and then never stop learning. I studied naval architecture. I qualified as a marine surveyor at 31. For 14 years I assessed vessels for structural integrity, cargo compliance, safety certification, and insurance purposes. I have been on hundreds of ships. I have crawled through void spaces and tank tops and engine rooms and cargo holds on vessels in every state of repair, from new build to end of service. I do not get unsettled by ships. I did not until 4 years ago, when I was commissioned to conduct a condition survey on a bulk carrier that had been sitting at anchor in a Scottish firth for 8 months with no crew aboard and no activity logged. The vessel was called the Maritime. She was old, built in the early 1980s, and she had changed hands 3 times in the last 6 years of her operational life. The commissioning party was a law firm acting for an insurance interest following a dispute over the vessel's last reported condition. I was given a set of plans, a security pass for the tender service that would take me out to her, and a 12-hour window to complete my preliminary survey. Standard work. I had done dozens of similar surveys on laid-up vessels, and they were always the same dead ship smell, systems cold, rust working at the edges of things, birds nesting in the bridge wings. I boarded the Maritime at 8 in the morning on a Tuesday in November. She was exactly as I expected for the first 3 hours. I started at the top and worked down, logging conditions deck by deck and compartment by compartment on the tablet I use for survey recording. The weather deck showed the expected deterioration for 8 months of unattended exposure in a Scottish firth. The bridge was intact with no structural issues. Accommodation was clean enough. The previous crew had apparently left in an orderly fashion, personal effects removed, lockers cleaned out. The engine room was cold and showed normal layup deterioration. I was making good time. I expected to be done before my window closed with time to spare. The ship's general arrangement plan I had been given showed 5 decks below the main deck. I had cleared 4 of them by noon without incident. The 5th deck, the lowest accessible deck above the double-bottom tanks, was where the plan showed only machinery spaces and void areas. When I reached the after section of deck 5, I found a watertight door that the plan I had been given did not show. The door was on the starboard side, in a position where the plan indicated solid hull framing. I checked the plan 3 times. The door was not on it. The door was real. It was steel, watertight, with a functioning handle, and it was not on any version of the general arrangement plan I had been given. I should have logged it, noted the discrepancy, and reported it. That is the professional response to a plan discrepancy. What I did instead was open it, which I recognize now as the moment the entire event shifted from professional to something I do not have a clean professional category for. Behind the door was a space that should not have existed given the vessel's external geometry. I want to be precise about this because I am a naval architect and I understand hull forms and internal volume and the relationship between them. The space behind that door was too large, not dramatically, not impossibly, but measurably, in a way that I could calculate in my head with reasonable confidence. Too large by approximately 4 meters in length for where it sat within the hull. There were 4 meters of interior space behind that door that did not correspond to any exterior space available in the hull at that point. The space was empty of equipment and fittings. The overhead was lower than the deck above would have suggested. The floor was clean plate steel. On the forward bulkhead, in white paint that looked significantly newer than anything else on the vessel, someone had written a series of numbers in a column. There were 11 numbers. They were each 7 digits long. The 4th number in the column was the same number that now appears on my survey report, on the tide table, and on the security pass. I photographed everything. I completed my survey. I submitted my report with a full account of the discrepancy, including the photographs. 2 weeks later, the law firm contacted me to ask about an error in my report specifically. They noted that I had referenced a compartment in the after section of Deck 5 that did not exist on the vessel's certified plans and asked me to remove the reference and resubmit. When I told them I had photographic evidence and would not remove the reference, they thanked me, told me they would note my position, and ended the call. The final survey report that was submitted to the insurance interest was not my report. My name was on it, but the text had been changed. The compartment was not mentioned. When I raised this with the professional body that governs my certification, they told me they had no record of my original submission and asked me to resubmit. I resubmitted with the photographs. I have not received a response in 4 years. The Maritime was sold for scrap 9 months after my survey. I do not know whether the compartment was noted by the dismantling yard. I do not know whether the painted numbers on that bulkhead went to the smelter or whether someone removed them first. I do not know what the numbers mean. I have fed them into every database and registry I have access to, and I have found nothing. The one match I have is the one that keeps appearing in documents associated with my own life, and work the 4th number in the column, appearing where it has no reason to be, in the right place on the wrong documents. I am a precise man by training and profession. I do not make errors in observation, and I do not mistake what I measured with my own tools. That compartment was real. Those 4 meters were real. And whatever was written on that bulkhead meant enough to someone that they had it removed from every official record they could reach before they allowed me to keep talking about it. They could not reach my memory. They have not managed that yet. I am still here, and I still have the photographs, and I am still talking. The water does not give up its records easily. That is the thing all of tonight's narrators have learned in different ways and at different costs. Marcus still has photographs of walls that should not exist. Elena has a freedom of information file that asks questions no one will answer. Terence paddles around a stretch of coast that has now found him twice. James has a number that keeps returning to him in documents that other people control. None of them have been given an explanation that accounts for what they experienced. None of them have closed the loop. The ocean keeps its structures below the surface, and the ships that cross it carry rooms inside rooms, sounds below sounds, and records that do not always survive the people who need them to. If you have experienced something on the water that has followed you home, we want to hear from you. The link is in the description. We read everything. Subscribe to Midnight Outcry and stay close. There is more coming.